He didn't die surrounded by enemies. Joe Masseria died sitting at a card table with men he trusted, and that betrayal ended the reign of the most feared mafia boss in America. Before Lucky Luciano modernized organized crime, before the five families were formally structured, one man ruled New York through violence, fear, and raw intimidation, and his name was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. Born on January 17, 1886, in Menfi, Sicily, Masseria grew up in poverty in a culture where survival often depended on loyalty and force rather than law. And from an early age, he absorbed the unspoken rules of power that governed Sicilian life. His family later moved to Marsala, another town deeply tied to Mafia tradition. And by the time Masseria immigrated to the United States in 1902, he was already primed for the criminal world waiting for him. New York City at the turn of the century was exploding with opportunity and violence, especially within Italian immigrant neighborhoods, where organized crime thrived in gambling dens, protection rackets, and extortion schemes that preyed on their own communities. Masseria quickly aligned himself with the Morello crime family, one of the earliest and most powerful mafia organizations in the city, operating out of Harlem and parts of Little Italy, and it wasn't long before police began taking notice of him. In 1909, Masseria was convicted of burglary and narrowly escaped prison with a suspended sentence. But 4 years later, in 1913, he was sentenced to 4 to 6 years for third-degree burglary, marking him as a repeat offender and placing him firmly on law enforcement radar. Even behind bars, Masseria built connections, and when he returned to the streets, he was more ambitious and ruthless than ever. As the 1910s came to an end, New York's mafia landscape was shifting rapidly as aging bosses died or were imprisoned, creating power vacuums that younger, more aggressive figures were eager to fill. And Masseria found himself locked in a bitter rivalry with Salvatore di Aquila, another powerful Sicilian boss who controlled significant territory in Manhattan. Their feud escalated into open warfare, marked by assassinations, ambushes, and public gun battles that stunned the city and overwhelmed police. In 1920, Masseria recruited a young, sharp-minded enforcer named Charles Lucky Luciano, a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. But at the time, Luciano was just another gunman willing to kill on command. D'Aquila, determined to eliminate Masseria, relied heavily on his most feared hitman, Umberto Valenti, who was ordered to hunt him down. And in May 1922, the conflict exploded when Vincenzo Terranova, head of the Morello family, was assassinated in a drive-by shooting near his Harlem home, followed hours later by the murder of his underboss in Lower Manhattan, both killings widely attributed to Valenti. That same night, Valenti attempted to finish the job by tracking down Masseria himself just blocks from police headquarters, a brazen act that showed how emboldened gangsters had become. Masseria escaped under a hail of gunfire, but the streets were left littered with wounded civilians. And although he was briefly arrested after tossing his weapon while fleeing, he once again walked free, reinforcing his growing belief that he was untouchable. Just months later, on August 9, 1922, Masseria was ambushed outside his apartment on 2nd Avenue when 2 gunmen opened fire at close range, chasing him into a nearby store as bullets shattered windows, shelves and walls. And even as the attackers fled in a stolen car, firing wildly into crowds and wounding bystanders, Masseria survived yet again. Police later found him upstairs in his apartment, shell-shocked but alive, sitting on his bed, still wearing a straw hat with 2 bullet holes punched clean through it, and that image became legend in the underworld. From that moment on, Masseria's reputation soared as gangsters began referring to him as the man who could dodge bullets, while D'Aquila's influence rapidly declined. Just 48 hours later, Umberto Valenti was gunned down in a cafe, executed with chilling efficiency, and rumours immediately spread that the killer was none other than Lucky Luciano, marking the first major turning point in Masseria's rise. By the mid-1920s, Giuseppe Masseria was known across New York as Joe the Boss, a title that reflected both his authority and the fear he inspired. And after Salvatore d'Aquila was assassinated in 1928, Masseria was elevated to Capo dei Capi, effectively becoming the most powerful mafia leader in America. His rule, however, was brutal and paranoid, as he demanded regular cash tributes from rival families, punished neutrality as betrayal, and allegedly ordered the murders of influential bosses like Gaspar Milazzo in Detroit and Gaetano Reina in the Bronx. Killings that sent shockwaves through the underworld and made it clear that Masseria would tolerate no dissent. Police suspected him in countless crimes, but could never gather enough evidence to make charges stick, and as Prohibition poured millions of dollars into bootlegging, Masseria's empire expanded rapidly, but so did resentment among younger gangsters who saw his leadership as outdated and reckless. By 1930, that resentment boiled over into what became known as the Castellamarese War, a full-scale mafia civil war that turned New York City into a battlefield. On one side stood Masseria, representing the old-world Sicilian style of rule based on fear and personal dominance, and on the other was Salvatore Maranzano, a calculating leader from Castellammare del Golfo who believed the mafia should operate with military-like structure, clear hierarchies, and long-term strategy. The war was relentless and merciless, with gunmen ambushing rivals in daylight, bodies discovered in offices, butcher shops and apartment hallways, and innocent civilians caught in the crossfire as bullets tore through crowded streets. Newspapers dubbed it the Mafia War, but police were largely powerless, as witnesses refused to talk and suspects vanished or turned up dead before they could testify. Masseria tightened his grip, forcing bosses like Niccolo Schiro to resign and pay enormous sums under threat of death, proving that even neutrality would not save anyone. But these tactics only deepened internal fractures within his own organization. Younger leaders like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello and Joe Adonis began questioning why they were risking their lives and profits for a man whose ego was costing them everything. And as the war dragged on, Masseria grew increasingly paranoid, issuing erratic orders and suspecting betrayal everywhere. One of the most devastating blows came in August 1930 when Giuseppe Morello, Masseria's trusted advisor and war strategist, was assassinated in his East Harlem office while collecting cash receipts, a killing that shocked the underworld and stripped Masseria of his most experienced lieutenant. With Morello gone and Maranzano's faction gaining momentum, secret negotiations began behind Masseria's back, and Lucky Luciano made the most important decision of his life by striking a deal with Maranzano to eliminate his own boss in exchange for control of Masseria's rackets and a position of power in the new Mafia order. Masseria sensed the betrayal and even considered having Luciano killed. But by then it was too late, as his own allies warned Luciano and sealed Masseria's fate. On April 15, 1931, Masseria was lured to a restaurant on Coney Island under the pretense of a friendly meeting, where he relaxed, played cards and felt secure among men he believed were loyal to him. At a key moment, Luciano excused himself to the restroom, and seconds later, gunmen stormed the table and opened fire, striking Masseria multiple times in the head, chest, and back, killing him instantly. When police arrived, they found the familiar signs of a Mafia execution. No witnesses willing to speak, no suspects who could be charged, and no clear answers. And although Luciano was questioned, he had an airtight alibi and was released. Joe Masseria was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, his empire collapsing almost overnight, and while his death did not immediately end the Castellamarese War, it marked the death of the old Sicilian-style mafia in America. In the months that followed, Lucky Luciano reorganized organized crime into a modern syndicate based on cooperation, profit-sharing, and structure rather than constant bloodshed, ensuring stability and longevity that Masseria could never achieve. Joe the Boss believed fear made him immortal. But in the Mafia, fear does not protect kings. Ambition replaces them, and betrayal ends them.